The morning James Trask rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, he looked like a man who had long since made peace with being nobody. And Rosa Lawson, watching from the porch of her late father's ranch, thought she had never seen anything so quietly broken in all her 26 years of living. He came up the road from the south, a tall figure on a dark roan gelding, his hat pulled low against the April sun that had no business shining so cheerfully on such a worn-down stretch of prairie. There was a bedroll strapped behind his saddle, a rifle in the scabbard, and nothing else to speak of. No pack mule, no saddlebags fat with possessions, no indication that a man of perhaps 35 years had accumulated anything worth carrying. He rode slowly, not from leisure, but from the particular exhaustion of a man who had been riding a long time and had learned not to hurry toward places that might turn him away. Rosa did not call out to him. She simply watched, one hand resting on the porch railing, the other holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. She had learned since her father Eli Lawson had passed the previous November that strangers came and went along this road with the same indifference as the wind. Some stopped. Most did not. This one stopped. He pulled his roan up at the gate, and though he did not open it right away, he looked at the sign nailed to the post, LAWSON Ranch, EST, 1871, with the kind of attention a man gives something he is trying to memorize. Then he looked up and saw her, and he did not look away, which surprised her. Most men with that much road dust on them looked away. "I heard there might be work," he said. His voice was lower than she expected and rough in the way of a man who did not use it frequently. Rosa set her cold coffee on the porch railing. "You heard right," she said. "Who told you?" "Fellow at the Meridian Saloon in town. Said the Lawson spread lost its foreman last month and was short on hands." That was true. Tom Briggs had taken his wages and his lumbago and gone to live with his daughter in Wichita, and the two young hands she had left, Pete Aldridge and Danny Holt, were good workers but boys still, not yet 20, without the experience a ranch of 800 acres required when calving season was bearing down like a freight train. "What's your name?" she asked. "James Trask." "Where are you coming from, James Trask?" He seemed to consider the question more seriously than it perhaps warranted. "Texas mostly. Before that, New Mexico. I've been moving around." "How long?" A pause that told her more than a direct answer might have. "A while," he said. Rosa came down off the porch steps and walked to the gate. Up close, she could see the lines in his face more clearly. Not just the ones the sun had put there, but the deeper ones, the ones that came from somewhere inside. His eyes were gray and direct, and though they were steady, there was something behind them that had been shuttered like windows in a house where someone had decided there was no point in letting the light in anymore. He was not an ugly man. That was, she admitted to herself, not entirely beside the point. "Can you calve?" she asked. "Yes." "Can you manage green hands without breaking their spirit?" Something flickered in his expression, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. "I'll do my best." "Can you fix fence?" "Yes." "Can you do it without being told twice?" "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. The roan shifted its weight and blew through its nose, impatient. James Trask did not move. "All right," she said, and unlatched the gate. 50 cents a day, meals included, bunkhouse out back. "You'll start this afternoon. I've got a heifer I'm watching that's been laboring since yesterday morning, and I don't like the way she's carrying." He swung down from the roan and led the horse through the gate, and Rosa noticed that even in that simple act, the way he spoke quiet and low to the horse, one hand on the neck, there was a carefulness that interested her. Not gentleness, exactly. More like the memory of gentleness, a habit the body kept even when the heart had given it up. She did not know then how right that observation was. His first days on the Lawson Ranch were efficient and almost entirely silent. He fixed 300 yards of downed fence along the north pasture before Pete and Danny had finished breakfast on his second morning. He identified a lame steer that Rosa had not noticed and treated it without being asked. He reorganized the tack room in a single evening. hanging everything in an order that made instinctive sense, and Rosa found herself standing in the doorway of it afterward, marveling at how a space she had navigated by memory for years could suddenly feel functional instead of merely familiar. He ate his meals in the bunkhouse alone, or if he came to the main house at Rosa's insistence. She ran a table, not a hotel, and she told him so plainly. He sat at the end and spoke only when spoken to. Pete and Danny were wary of him at first, in the way young men are wary of a competence they cannot yet measure, but within a week they had relaxed into something like respect. He corrected them without humiliating them. He showed rather than told. When Danny Holt made a mess of a branding and cursed himself loudly in the way boys did, James Trask simply handed him a damp cloth and said, "Try again, slower this time." And there was no impatience in it at all. Rosa watched all of this from a careful distance. She was not a woman who jumped to conclusions. Her father had raised her on this land with a practical philosophy. See what a person does, not what they say they are, and give it enough time to matter. She had been running the Lawson ranch since her father's health had started failing 2 years before his death, and she ran it competently. She knew cattle, knew land, knew the particular arithmetic of the Kansas frontier, what the weather owed you and what it did not, which neighbors could be trusted, and which ones were waiting for you to fail so they could offer you a low price on the land. She was not naive. She was also, if she was honest, profoundly tired in a way she did not talk about. A tiredness that had nothing to do with the physical work and everything to do with carrying it alone. She had come close to marrying once, 3 years ago. A man named Harold Prout from Caldwell proper who had good manners and a decent hardware business, and who had called on her with an earnestness she had found touching and ultimately insufficient. She had not been able to explain to him, or to herself with any clarity, what was missing. Only that when she imagined waking up next to Harold Prout for the next 40 years, she felt nothing, not dread, not joy, just a flat, beige expanse like the prairie when it had nothing blooming in it. She did not think about James Trask in those terms, not yet. He was an employee, a man who had arrived at her gate with useful hands and a closed face, and that was enough for now. But she did think about him. She thought about the way he moved through work without complaint or theater. She thought about the way he sometimes stood at the fence line in the evening, looking at nothing in particular with an expression she could not read from a distance. She thought about the fact that he had been a month on her ranch, and she knew almost nothing about him, not where he had been before Texas, not whether he had family, not what had made him the particular shape of quiet that he was. In the second week of April, the heifer Rosa had been watching finally went into hard labor, and it went badly. She had noticed the signs early that morning, the restlessness, the repeated lying down and rising, the flank sweating, and had sent Danny to fetch the local veterinarian, Doc Hadley, who lived 4 miles west of town. But by the time Danny returned an hour later with the news that Doc Hadley had broken his wrist the day before and could not make the ride, the heifer was in genuine distress, and time had become a problem. James Trask was already in the barn when Rosa arrived, having assessed the situation with the quiet efficiency she was coming to expect from him. He had rolled up his sleeves, was crouched beside the heifer in the straw, speaking to her in a low and even voice. "Back legs," he said without looking up. "Calf's coming wrong." Rosa pulled her hair back and tied it. "Can you turn it? Going to try." What followed was 30 minutes of hard, careful work, the kind that had no room for squeamishness or uncertainty. James Trask worked with patient concentration, and Rosa knelt at the heifer's head, stroking her, murmuring to her, keeping her as calm as a laboring cow in pain could be kept. Pete stood at the barn door, white-faced and helpful. Danny brought fresh water without being asked. The calf came at last with a rush that startled everyone, even James, who caught it with both hands in the straw, and it was the smallest thing Rosa had seen come out of a heifer in years. A little bull calf, red and white and shining with birth, not yet moving, not yet breathing. "Come on," James said. He cleared the calf's face, rubbed the little body with rough straw, worked at it with a focus that was absolute. Rosa watched his face. There was something there she had not seen before, a concentration that was more than technical, something that looked almost like urgency, almost like caring. The calf shuddered and blinked and took its first rattling breath. James sat back on his heels in the straw. He had blood on his forearms and straw in his hair, and he looked at the calf with an expression Rosa would carry with her for a very long time. "There you go," he said quietly, to the calf and to no one. The heifer turned and began to clean her calf with the automatic devotion of new motherhood, and the calf trembled on its impossible legs, and James Trask sat in the straw and watched it, and Rosa watched him. She said nothing. She let the moment be what it was. Later, when the barn had settled and the calf was nursing and Pete and Danny had gone to wash up for supper, Rosa found herself lingering. She had brought a bucket of fresh water for the heifer and was checking the mother over when she noticed that James was still there, seated now on a hay bale near the stall wall, his forearms resting on his knees, watching the calf in the particular way of a man who has found something he did not expect to need. "She'll do well," Rosa said. "The calf, too. He's small, but he's determined." James looked up. "Yes," he said. Rosa finished her check and latched the stall. She picked up her bucket and started toward the barn door, then stopped, because something in her would not let her just walk away from what she had seen on his face. "That was good work today," she said. "It's what you hired me for. It's more than that and you know it." She paused. "Where did you learn to do that, the turning? Not every cowhand knows how." He was quiet for a moment. "I used to have my own place," he said, and the words came out carefully like he was testing the weight of them. "Down in the Texas Hill Country, small operation, lot of cattle, lot of calves." Rosa waited. He looked at the calf, who was making small, inefficient attempts to walk. "I sold it," he said. 12 years ago. Sold everything." "Why?" The question was direct and she knew it, but she was not a woman who went around things when she could go through them. James was quiet for long enough that she thought he was not going to answer. Then he said, "My wife died, our boy too, the same winter. Fever took them both inside of 2 weeks." He said it flatly, not brutally, in the way of a man who has rehearsed the words enough times that they have worn smooth. "After that, the land didn't feel like mine anymore. So I left." Rosa stood in the doorway of her own barn and felt the weight of what he had just told her land in her chest with a soft, heavy thud. "I'm sorry," she said. And because she was Rosa Lawson and meant things when she said them, it was not a courtesy. It was a real thing, offered across the straw-smelling air between them. James looked at her. Really looked at her, not with the careful blankness he usually kept in place, but with something more open and more raw, and he said, "Thank you." And she could hear that he meant that too. She left him there with the calf and the heifer and the long evening coming in through the barn's high window, and she walked back to the main house feeling like the ground under her feet had shifted slightly, just enough to notice. She did not sleep well that night. The following weeks had a quality to them that Rosa could only describe, to herself, as new-made, like leather that has been soaked and shaped and is still drying into its final form. Something between them had changed in the barn that evening, not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself, but changed nonetheless. A door cracked open. James began to eat his suppers at the main house without being pressed. He began to offer opinions when she asked for them, and occasionally when she did not, and she found she did not mind. He and Pete had apparently reached some kind of understanding that involved a great deal of card playing in the bunkhouse and a moderate amount of storytelling, judging by the laughter Rosa could sometimes hear from the main house porch on warm nights. He was not, she realized, a man without warmth. He was a man who had decided warmth was dangerous and had been maintaining that decision for over a decade, and the decision was starting very quietly to come apart. The calf was doing beautifully. They had named him Red, which was Pete's idea and was not imaginative but was accurate. He was sturdy and suspicious and followed the heifer with a possessive loyalty that amused everyone. James checked on him every morning without being asked, and Rosa, who noticed everything about her ranch, noticed this. On a Thursday in late April, a rider came up the road from Caldwell with a letter for Rosa. It was from a lawyer in Wichita named Gideon Stokes, representing a cattle consortium called the Western Grazing Company, and it was an offer to purchase the Lawson Ranch at a price that was, she had to admit, not insulting. The Western Grazing Company had been acquiring land throughout Sumner County for 2 years, assembling large blocks of pasture for industrial-scale cattle operations, and they had apparently turned their attention to her 800 acres, which sat between 2 parcels they already owned. Rosa read the letter twice at the kitchen table and then set it down and looked at the window for a while. She was not desperate. She had income enough from the fall cattle sale and the grain lease on the East 40 to keep the ranch solvent through another year, at least. But she was also not unaware of the pressures that were reshaping the Kansas frontier in 1882, the way the big money from the East was changing what a small, independent rancher could sustain. The railroad had come through Caldwell 2 years prior, which was good for cattle prices, but also brought the kind of commerce and ambition that made the old way of doing things feel fragile. She was thinking about all of this when James came in for supper that evening, and she was apparently not hiding it well enough because he sat down across the table from her and looked at the letter before she had said a word. "Bad news?" he asked. She slid it across the table to him. He read it carefully, taking his time, and handed it back. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking I don't want to sell," she said. "My father homesteaded this land. He worked himself half to death building it, and then the other half keeping it. The idea of handing it over to a consortium that will fold it into some enormous commercial operation and erase every single thing he built." She stopped. "Then don't," James said. "It's not that simple. It usually isn't, but the answer to the question of whether you want to is pretty simple." She looked at him. "You sound certain." "I'm certain about that particular piece," he said. "The wanting, everything else is complicated, but a person ought to start from knowing what they want. And if what I want isn't possible," he was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes it is," he said, "and you don't know until you've tried long enough." There was something in the way he said it that she thought was not entirely about her ranch, and she held his gaze for just a beat longer than was strictly conversational before looking back down at the letter. She wrote back to Gideon Stokes the following morning and declined the offer. She felt better for having done it. May arrived with the particular exuberance of a Kansas spring, all wind and sky and the smell of things growing, and the Lawson Ranch moved into its busiest season. There were fence lines to recheck after the winter, pastures to rotate, branding to finish, equipment to mend before the summer heat made everything harder. James Trask worked through all of it without complaint and with an increasing ease that suggested he had found his footing, not just on the work, but on the land itself. Rosa saw it happen the way she saw the grass greening up. Not in one dramatic moment, but in accumulation, in the way he began to know the ranch's particular habits and rhythms, the soft spot in the north fence that always needed attention after a rain, the way the south pasture dried out first and needed to be watched for lamenesses in the cattle that wandered there. He learned these things the way you could only learn them if you were paying attention because you cared, not just because you were paid to. She began to find reasons to work beside him rather than in parallel. She told herself this was efficient, that there was no sense in 2 people learning the same problem separately, and this was true but not the whole truth. He had an easiness with her that she had not expected from their first conversation, given how closed he had seemed. When he disagreed with her about the rotation schedule, about whether to buy 2 new horses or 1, about when to move the cattle from the east pasture, he said so plainly and without apology, and she respected that enormously. She had found in her years of running the ranch that men often had difficulty disagreeing with her directly, resorting instead to a passive roundabout approach that she found maddening. James Trask said exactly what he thought. When she was right, he said so. When she was wrong, he said that too, And then he did what she asked anyway, because he understood the difference between his opinion and her authority. One afternoon in the second week of May, they rode the fence line together along the western boundary, checking stakes and wire after a line of storms had moved through the night before. The sky was freshly washed and enormous, the kind of sky that only existed in Kansas, Rosa thought, the kind that made you feel simultaneously very small and very necessary. The prairie stretched in every direction, the grass still bent from yesterday's wind, the morning light sharp and clean. They worked in a comfortable quiet, Rosa noting which posts needed replacing and James pounding the ones that had loosened. At the far corner of the western fence, where the Lawson land met the boundary of Hector Ray's adjoining spread to the north, they stopped to rest the horses, and Rosa sat on a flat rock and looked out at the land that was hers and felt, for the first time in a long while, purely glad. "Can I ask you something?" she said. James was checking the roans near Foreleg, which had a tendency to stock up on long rides. "Go ahead. In 12 years of moving around, did you never want to stop, find another place, start over?" He straightened and looked out at the horizon, his hat in his hands. "I thought about it," he said, "a few times." "What stopped you?" "Fear, mostly." He said it without shame or elaborate qualification, just stated it. "I was afraid that anything I tried to build again would just go the same way, that the wanting of it would be its own kind of danger." Rosa looked at him carefully. "That's a hard way to live." "It is," he said, "but it felt safer than the alternative." "Does it still?" she asked, and she was aware, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was no longer talking only about land. He looked at her then, and she held his gaze and did not look away, and what passed between them in that moment was not a declaration. It was a question, mutual and uncertain, and neither of them had the answer yet, but the asking of it felt like something important. "I don't know," he said, and the honesty of it was enough. They rode back to the ranch in the late morning light with a mile of fence documented between them and something unspoken and alive suspended in the air above the roan's hoofbeats. The following Sunday, which was the one day of the week Rosa tried to keep lighter, she made a large midday meal, beef stew and cornbread, an extravagance of effort for a working ranch, and invited Pete and Danny to eat at the main house, which she did occasionally when she felt the need for company at the table. James came in last, having been at the barn with Red, who was giving Pete trouble about being weaned. Pete was talking about a traveling show that had come through Caldwell the previous month, some sort of medicine man with a wagon and a magnetic personality, and a series of claims about a tonic that could cure everything from snakebite to melancholy. And Danny was laughing at the memory of it, and James was listening with the mild expression he wore when other people's happiness was a thing he could be adjacent to without quite joining. Rosa watched him laugh at something Pete said, a real laugh, short and genuine, and something inside her chest turned over in a slow, warm way. After supper, Pete and Danny disappeared back to the bunkhouse with a deck of cards and the particular energy of 20-year-olds, and Rosa and James remained at the table with their coffee, because neither of them moved to go. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window and fell across the table in a long golden stripe, and the ranch was quiet outside except for the sound of the wind in the cottonwoods. "Tell me something about yourself that nobody here knows," Rosa said. James looked surprised by the question, then amused. "That's a particular kind of request. I'm a particular kind of woman." He considered it. "I used to read," he said, "books, a lot of them. My wife," he paused just for a beat, "she was the one who started it. She had a whole crate of them when we married. I read every one of them twice." Rosa felt something warm and a little sad at the same time. "What kind of books?" "History mostly, some philosophy, whatever she had." He paused. "I haven't read a book in years, haven't had one." "I have a whole shelf of them," Rosa said, "over there." He looked at the bookshelf against the parlor wall as if he was noticing it for the first time, which she supposed he might be. He was not a man who wandered through other people's rooms. "You're welcome to them," she said. "Any time." He looked back at her. "Thank you, Rosa." He had used her first name before, but not often, and this time it landed differently, with a warmth that made her look down at her coffee cup and then very deliberately look back up, because she had decided years ago that she was not a woman who retreated from things that mattered. "You're welcome, James," she said. That evening he borrowed a book, a history of the Comanche nation that Rosa had read twice herself and valued considerably, and she watched him walk back to the bunkhouse with it under his arm and felt unreasonably pleased. Things had a way, that spring, of moving forward in small steps that only looked small individually. Taken together, they amounted to a considerable journey. Rosa found that she looked forward to supper with a specific eagerness that had nothing to do with hunger. James had begun to tell stories, occasionally, when the mood was right, not long, elaborate ones, but small, careful ones. A funny thing that had happened at a ranch in New Mexico. An observation about cattle behavior he had never been able to explain. Once a memory of his wife that came out unexpected and sat at the table with them for a moment before he put it away gently and moved on. Rosa understood from watching him that these stories were a form of trust offered incrementally, like water from a cistern you could not draw from too fast or you would exhaust it. She offered her own. She told him about her father, who had been a man of tremendous physical stubbornness and very little vocabulary for emotion, who had shown love entirely through action. The way he had rebuilt the barn after it burned in 1877, working 18-hour days for 3 weeks straight. The way he had driven 40 miles to the nearest town to find a doctor when Rosa was 8 and had scarlet fever. The way he had, every single morning for as long as she could remember, brushed the hair out of her face and said, "Good morning, Rosie," as if it were a prayer. James listened to all of it with the attentiveness of a man who had been in the habit of not listening to things for a long time and was finding his way back to it. "He sounds like someone worth missing," he said, when she had told the story about the barn. "He was," she said. "He is." In early June, Hector Reyes, a rancher of 50-odd years whose family had worked the land north of the Lawson, spread since before Kansas was a state, rode over with his wife Maria and their youngest daughter, Elena, bringing a basket of bread and the neighborhood intelligence that Rosa had been living without proper social contact since her father died. Hector and Eli Lawson had been friends and occasional business partners, and Hector had a paternal concern for Rosa that he expressed primarily through visits and unsolicited agricultural advice. He shook James Trask's hand when they were introduced and looked at him with the frank assessment of an older man who had seen many drifting hands come and go and had developed reliable opinions about them. "You doing good work here?" Hector asked. "Trying to," James said. Hector looked at Rosa. Rosa gave him nothing. Hector looked back at James. "Good," he said, as if he had taken a measurement and it had come out satisfactory. Maria Reyes hugged Rosa and sat with her on the porch and talked for 2 hours in the comfortable ranging way of old friends, covering weather, cattle prices, the new Presbyterian minister in Caldwell who was apparently very earnest and very young, and the state of Rosa's heart, which Maria approached carefully, and with the skill of a woman who had known Rosa since she was a child. "He seems steady," Maria said, nodding toward the barn where James and Hector had migrated to discuss some matter of post-hole technique. "He's a good foreman," Rosa said. Said Maria, which contained volumes. "Don't," Rosa said. "I didn't say anything. You were about to." Maria smiled and said nothing, which was worse. That evening, after the Reyes family had gone home in the long June twilight, Rosa sat on the porch steps with her coffee and thought about what Maria had not said, and admitted to herself, with the careful precision she applied to most things, that she was falling in love with James Trask. She sat with that admission for a while. It did not frighten her. She was 26 years old and had worked too hard for too long to be frightened by the fact of her own feelings. What she was, instead, was cautious not for her own sake, but for his. She had heard the flatness in his voice when he talked about his wife and son. She had seen it in his face in the barn with the newborn calf, that complex of grief and tenderness, and the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent years not allowing himself either. She did not want to push anything. She wanted to give it room, but she was also Rosa Lawson, and she did not believe in indefinite waiting. The decision came to her, as her best decisions did, while she was working, specifically while she was patching a section of the barn roof on a still June afternoon, the smell of hot tar and fresh wood around her, her hands occupied, her mind free to be honest with itself. She was not going to say anything explicit. She was not that kind of woman, not in the sense of making speeches. But she was going to stop standing at a careful distance from him, and she was going to let him see what she actually felt, and she was going to trust that a man who had lived through what he had lived through was capable of recognizing something real when it was offered to him. The opportunity came, as opportunities often did on a ranch, in the form of something that needed doing. There was a wild storm that rolled in from the west on a Thursday evening in mid-June, the kind that dropped the temperature 20 degrees in an hour and turned the sky the color of a bruise and made every animal on the Lawson spread restless and loud. Rosa sent Pete and Danny to secure the horses and the loose equipment, and she and James went to the cattle. They spent 2 hours in wind and spitting rain, moving cattle, checking water, securing gates and outbuildings. By the time the worst of it had passed, they were both soaked and cold and standing in the muddy yard behind the main house, and the rain had softened to a steady drizzle, and the world smelled like wet earth and lightning and something clean. Rosa pushed her wet hair off her face and looked at James Trask and laughed. It was not a polite laugh. It was the laugh of a woman who had just spent 2 hours fighting a storm and had come out on the winning side and found the whole affair genuinely funny. The way hard physical comedy is funny, and James looked at her laughing and something happened on his face. Not the shadow of a smile this time, but the real thing, full and unguarded, the first time she had seen it at full strength, and it transformed him, made him look younger and less sealed. And Rosa's laugh shifted into something quieter as she looked at him. They were standing very close. The rain came down around them. "Come inside and get dry," she said. "I'll make coffee." He did not immediately move. He looked at her, and in the gray post-storm light his face was open in a way she had not yet seen, the shutters down, everything behind them visible. "Rosa," he said, and her name in his mouth had a particular weight to it, careful and significant. "James," she said, with the same weight back. He reached out and tucked a strand of wet hair behind her ear, the gesture slow and deliberate, and his hand was warm against her cold face, and Rosa stood very still and let it happen and felt the whole long spring accumulating in that moment, all of it, the calf and the fence line and the suppers and the books and the stories offered carefully across a kitchen table. He took his hand back. "I haven't," he started, then stopped. "I know," she said gently. "It's been a long time since I let myself. I know that too." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not in a hurry, James, but I'm also not going to pretend I don't know what this is." He looked at her with that open, raw expression and said, very quietly, "Neither am I." They stood in the rain for another moment, and then she said, "Coffee. Now. You're going to catch your death." And she walked inside, and he followed her, and the door closed behind them on the wet night, and the rain went on without them. The summer that followed was the happiest Rosa Lawson had known since before her father got sick. It was a happiness that did not announce itself but was woven into every ordinary thing. The mornings, which had always been Rosa's best time of day and which were now better. The shared work, which had always been satisfying and which was now shot through with something extra. The small collisions of glances, the accidental proximity of two people who were finding reasons to be near each other. The evenings on the porch, which had always been peaceful, and which were now also warm in a way that had nothing to do with the Kansas summer. James Trask unfurled slowly. That was the only word for it. Like something that had been coiled tight for protection and was, cautiously and with occasional retreats, uncurling. There were still quiet days, days when something sat heavily behind his eyes and he was more closed than open, and Rosa had learned to give him room on those days without withdrawing from him, which was a particular skill of love, she thought, the ability to stay present without pressing. But there were more days that were good than days that were not, and the proportion kept improving. He had started talking about his son, about Daniel, who had been 4 years old when he died, who had been tremendously interested in horses and had no fear of them whatsoever, who had had his mother's dark eyes and a laugh that James said you could hear from the other side of the pasture. He talked about his wife, Ellen, who had been quiet and funny in the way some quiet people were, who had loved books and had very definite opinions about coffee, and had been the most purely competent person James had ever known. Rosa listened to all of it carefully. She understood that being trusted with a person's grief was not a small thing. She understood that James was handing her something very fragile and that her job was to hold it without flinching and without attempting to fix it. "Do you think," she said one evening when they were sitting on the porch in the heat of a July night, "that there is a certain amount of happiness a person is allowed, like a ration?" James looked at her sideways. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you think sometimes that wanting to be happy again is somehow disloyal to Ellen, to Daniel?" He was quiet for a long time, looking out at the dark yard. "Yes," he said finally, "I have thought that. And I've been thinking lately that Ellen would have found that idea fairly ridiculous," he said. "She was practical. She would have said that grief was one thing and life was another, and that stopping your life because you were grieving was a waste of both." Rosa said nothing. She let that sit. "She would have liked you," James said, and he said it simply, not as a compliment or a contrivance but as a plain fact. Rosa looked at the dark sky above the cottonwoods and felt the night air on her face and said, "I think I would have liked her too." In July, the Western Grazing Company sent another letter, this one significantly less polite than the first. It was from a different man, not Gideon Stokes, but someone named Franklin Coates, who identified himself as a regional acquisitions manager, and who used language that managed to be both formal and threatening, referencing disputed water rights along the creek that ran through the south edge of the Lawson property, and suggesting that Rosa would benefit from reconsidering her previous refusal. Rosa read this letter at the kitchen table with James across from her and Hector Reyes, who had ridden over for an unrelated reason, sitting at the end. Hector read the letter and made a sound that was not polite. "These men," he said, "they do this. They find a small thing to make large, to pressure people." "Are the water rights actually disputed?" James asked. "Not as far as I know," Rosa said. "My father recorded that creek as part of the original land grant. It's been documented for 11 years. "Then get your documents in order and write back with the specific reference," James said. "Don't threaten in return, don't bluster. Just state the fact with the documentation attached and make it clear you know your rights." "You know about this kind of thing?" Rosa said. "I've seen it before in Texas. Companies like this rely on people not knowing their own legal standing. If you know yours, they usually move on to someone who doesn't." Hector nodded approvingly. Practical advice. Rosa wrote the letter that afternoon, with James sitting across the table and reading drafts, suggesting a correction here, a clarification there. The final version was a model of composed legal precision that Rosa felt very good about. She wrote it to the post office herself. Franklin Coates wrote back once more in August with a slightly less aggressive tone and a revised offer that was notably higher than the first. Rosa declined it politely and with finality, and after that, the Western Grazing Company turned its attention elsewhere. She did not hear from them again. She told James that evening over supper and watched him smile. That real smile, the one she had begun to feel, was partly hers, something she had helped bring back into the world, and felt a satisfaction that was compounded of the professional and the personal in a way that seemed exactly right. In August, something shifted between them that had been building all summer with the slow momentum of river water. They had ridden out to check the eastern herd late in the afternoon, and had been caught by the sunset on the way back. which in Kansas in August was not something you could ignore or hurry through. It happened over the course of 20 minutes, the whole western sky turning from gold to orange to a deep, impossible rose, the prairie underneath it going dark and silver, and they sat on their horses side by side and watched it in a silence that was complete and companionable. Rosa looked at James in the last of the light, and he was already looking at her, and there was nothing complicated in his expression. There was just her. Looked at with the full attention of a man who had decided to stop protecting himself from the things he wanted. "I have something I need to tell you," he said. "Then tell me." "I came here with nothing," he said. "Nothing I cared about. I hadn't." He stopped. Started again. "I hadn't let myself care about anything in a very long time. I thought it was safer. I thought I was protecting myself. But I think mostly I was just hiding, and I was so used to it that I had stopped noticing." Rosa listened. "You changed that," he said. "This ranch, this place. You specifically." He paused. "I don't have a great deal to offer you, Rosa. I have some wages saved and whatever skills I have, and," he paused again, "whatever I am. Which I know is not a simple or an easy thing." "James," she said, "I'm not finished." "All right. I know what I feel," he said. "I know it's real because it scares me, and the last time something felt real and scared me in this particular way was a very long time ago." His voice was steady but not casual. "I would like, if you are willing, to try to build something here. With you. Not just to work for you, but to be here in the real sense of it." The prairie breathed around them in the last of the sunset, and a night bird called somewhere in the grass. And Rosa Lawson looked at this man who had arrived at her gate in April with nothing but useful hands and a sealed face and said, "Yes." Just that. But she meant it with the whole of herself, and he knew it. He crossed the distance between their horses and took her hand, and she turned her hand to hold his back, and they sat like that for a long moment in the last red light above the Kansas grass, while the stars began to come out one by one. They did not rush. Neither of them was a person who rushed important things. September on the Lawson Ranch was cattle time, the preparation for the fall drive to the railroad at Caldwell, the sorting and tallying, the paperwork and negotiations. It was the most demanding month of the ranching year, and left little room for anything that was not work. James and Rosa worked side by side through it with the easy efficiency of two people who had learned each other's rhythms completely, who knew without asking who would take which task, who could read a problem in each other's face before it was spoken. Pete and Danny had noticed the change between them, of course. They were 20-year-old boys, not idiots. Pete had made one cheerful comment about it, and then been silenced by a look from James that was not threatening but was very clear, after which both young men conducted themselves with admirable restraint, and only the very occasional barely suppressed grin. Hector Reyes came by in September and shook James's hand and said, "You are staying, then," in a way that was not a question but a welcome, and James said, "I am." And Hector nodded and looked satisfied in the manner of a man whose opinion of people had been confirmed. Maria came with him and sat with Rosa in the kitchen while the men talked cattle outside. And this time Rosa told her plainly and without evasion what she had not confirmed in June. And Maria made the sound of a woman whose prayers have been answered and hugged Rosa so hard that Rosa's coffee spilled. The cattle drive went well. It was a good market. The prices fair, and Rosa came back from Caldwell with enough money to see the ranch through the winter comfortably, and to put something aside for a new bull she had been thinking about. She also came back on the afternoon of the drive's completion, to find James standing in the yard in front of the main house with his hat in his hands and an expression on his face that she had learned to read. It was the expression he wore when he had something important to say and was working up to saying it correctly. She swung down from her horse and handed the reins to Pete and looked at James. "Something on your mind," she said. "Several things," he said. "Could we walk?" They walked to the fence line at the edge of the south pasture, where the creek ran cold and clear in the early October light, and the cottonwoods were just beginning to turn yellow at the edges, and the air had the particular quality of early autumn in Kansas, clean and a little sharp. "I have been thinking," James said, "about what I said back in August, about wanting to build something. I remember. I want to be clear about what I mean by that," he said. "I don't mean just to stay on as a hand, even a valued one. I mean, I want to be your partner, Rosa, in every sense. I want to marry you." He said it plainly and looked at her directly and waited. Rosa looked at the creek and the yellow cottonwoods and the wide autumn sky, and she felt a fullness in her chest that was happiness. She realized purely and straightforwardly happiness, the uncomplicated kind, the kind that had no anxiety in it. "James Trask," she said, "I thought you were never going to ask." His expression broke into that real, full smile, and he laughed, that short, genuine laugh she had first heard at the kitchen table in May, and he reached out and took her hand, and she stepped forward and put her free hand against his chest, and he put his arms around her in the first afternoon light of the Oklahoma autumn, and they stood together at the edge of the south pasture and let it be what it was. "Is that a yes?" he said. "That is absolutely a yes," she said into his shoulder. They married in November in the Caldwell Presbyterian Church, which was indeed tended by a very young and very earnest minister named Reverend David Alcott, who performed the ceremony with a warmth that made up for his inexperience. Hector and Maria Reyes were there. Pete and Danny were there, washed and combed and looking like they had been polished, seated in the front pew with the expressions of men who had witnessed something they intended to feel proud about for the rest of their lives. A dozen or so neighbors and townspeople rounded out the small assembly. Rosa wore her mother's green dress, altered to fit her, and James wore a jacket he had bought new from the dry goods store on Main Street, and which fit him well, and which he would wear on important occasions for the rest of his life. They stood at the front of the small church and looked at each other during the vows with the direct steadiness that was characteristic of both of them, and when James said, "I do," his voice was quiet and certain in a way that made Maria Reyes squeeze her husband's arm hard enough to make him wince. The reception was at the ranch, which Rosa had decorated with late-season wildflowers and lanterns hung from the porch eaves, and Hector brought a fiddle player from the Reyes family's extended musical circle, and there was dancing in the yard under a cold November sky brilliant with stars, and Rosa danced with her husband, and felt the word land in her with the satisfying weight of something that had been a long time coming and had arrived right on time. The winter was the first winter in many years that James Trask did not face alone, and he found, to his own considerable surprise, that this made a larger difference than he had calculated. The ranch in winter was its own world, quieter, turned inward, the work continuing but slowed, the days shorter, the evenings long and firelit. He and Rosa settled into the rhythms of it with the ease of two people who had already spent a season learning each other's silences and found them companionable. He finished the history of the Comanche Nation and moved on to 3 other books from Rosa's shelf, and they developed the habit of reading together in the evenings, each with a book, the fire going, the wind outside, neither of them needing to fill every moment with words. He told her more things that winter. About his parents, who had been farmers in Tennessee, and who had come west when James was 12 with the optimism of people who believed in frontier opportunity. About the early years of his and Ellen's marriage, when they had been young and broke and tremendously hopeful. About the winter of 1870, which he had not spoken of in any real detail before, when the fever had come and taken first Daniel and then Ellen in the space of 16 days, and how he had sat in the empty house on the hill country ranch afterward for 3 weeks before he could make himself move. Rosa listened to all of it, sitting close to him by the fire, not trying to heal it or minimize it, just bearing witness. She understood by now that bearing witness was what was required, not repair, just presence. One evening in December, James was quiet for a long time after telling her about the last day with Ellen, and then he said, "I want you to know something." "Tell me," she said. "What happened then?" he said slowly. doesn't diminish this. I need you to know that. You are not a consolation or a substitute or me making the best of things. You are, he stopped, searching for it. You are something entirely separate and entirely real, and I am more grateful for you than I have words for. Rosa put her hand over his on the armrest of the chair. I know, she said, and so are you for me. They sat in the firelight, and the winter went on outside, and the Lawson Ranch, the Trask Ranch now, in both their names stood solid against the cold. Spring came back around as it always did, with that particular Kansas extravagance. And with spring came calving season again, and with calving season came the second year's particular resonances. Red the bull calf, now a sturdy and opinionated yearling, had been moved to his own pasture the previous fall, and was proving to be exactly the temperamental character that Pete had predicted, bossy with the other young stock, inclined to test fences, deeply attached to a certain corner of the south pasture where the grass was sweetest, and inexplicably responsive to James's voice in a way that was observed and remarked upon by everyone on the ranch. He remembers, Pete said confidently, one morning when James walked into the south pasture, and Red ambled over to him with the comfortable familiarity of an animal that knew exactly who had brought him into the world. He was the first thing you ever held on this ranch. James ran his hand along Red's neck and looked thoughtful and said nothing, and Rosa, watching from the fence, thought about that April evening in the barn and what she had seen on his face then, and felt the echo of it now, a year later, different but connected. The first calving of their first married spring went smoothly. There were 12 calves in 2 weeks, healthy, strong-legged, adding their voices to the general morning noise of the ranch. James and Rosa worked the births together as naturally as they did everything else, a partnership in the fullest sense of the word. On the 15th of April, exactly a year almost to the day, from when James had come up the road on his roan and stopped at the Lawson gate, Rosa waited until the morning work was done and the new calves accounted for, and then she told James something. She told him the way she told him most important things, directly and clearly, looking at his face to see it change. I'm going to have a baby, she said. He was quiet for long enough that she felt a small flutter of uncertainty, and then she saw his face change in the way she had been watching it change since the previous spring, a cracking open, a door coming off its hinges, something that had been sealed for a very long time being offered light. Rosa, he said, and his voice was different, stripped down to something purely essential. Yes, she said. He put both hands on her face and looked at her, and she watched him move through something. She could not name all the pieces of it, grief and joy and terror and tenderness, the full complexity of a man who had loved a child and lost him and was being offered the chance to love again, and she did not look away from any of it. Then he pulled her close against him, both arms completely, and she felt him breathe. All right, he said. All right. All right is not precisely the declaration I was hoping for, she said, into his shoulder. He laughed, that real laugh warm against her hair. I am overwhelmed, he clarified. I am overwhelmed in the very best way. I am, he pulled back just enough to look at her. I am so happy I don't know what to do with myself. That, she said, is better. The summer of 1883 passed on the Lawson Trask Ranch in a state of productive and expanding joy. They hired a third hand, a solid man named Clarence Webb who came from Oklahoma with good references and a gift for horses. Pete had grown into a confident young cowhand and Danny was not far behind, and the ranch operated with a smoothness that had taken 2 years to achieve and now felt like its natural state. Rosa's pregnancy was not an obstacle. She was a practical woman on a working ranch, and she continued to work at the tasks she could manage, modified the ones she should, and delegated the ones she could not. James was solicitous in a way that was careful not to tip into overprotection, because he had learned who she was and knew that overprotecting her was the fastest way to earn her irritation. They talked about the baby in the evenings, which gave the long summer nights a particular texture. Names, the second bedroom that would need to be refurnished, whether the crib that had come from Rosa's parents' household was still sound enough to use. They talked about what kind of person they were hoping for, which led to long and enjoyable conversations about people they had known and qualities they admired, and these conversations were, Rosa thought, among the best they had. James talked about Daniel. He did it more freely now, less as a wound being carefully managed and more as a memory that belonged to him and that he was willing to share. He told Rosa about Daniel's voice, about the way he had run everywhere, never walked, about the toy horse he had carried everywhere and which had been made, originally, from a sock and some buttons, and which Daniel had treated as the most real and important horse in the world. "I would like," James said one evening, "for this child to know about him, about Daniel. Is that a strange thing to want?" "It's a good thing to want," Rosa said. "A child should know their history, all of it." He looked at her steadily. "You're sure?" "James, I'm asking you to bring everything you are into this family. That includes what came before. Daniel and Ellen are part of you, and they will be part of this too. Not as ghosts or as burdens, but as people who mattered and who made you who you are." She paused. "I want all of you. I have from the beginning." He took her hand. He held it the way a person holds something they are very careful with, and she knew she had known it for some time, but she felt it again newly in that moment, that he was happy. Not without grief, not without the complexity of his history, but happy in the deep true way, the way that had room in it for everything. Their son was born on a Tuesday in October, a clear and cold morning that smelled of late harvest. The Caldwell midwife, a no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Eula Crane, who had attended more births than she could count over 30 years of practice, presided with calm authority. James was present throughout, sitting where Rosa could see him and hold his hand during the hard parts, which she did with a grip that he mentioned afterward had been considerably stronger than he expected, and which she told him was exactly the correct strength. The boy came into the world loud and objecting, which Mrs. Crane said was a very good sign, and he was red-faced and substantial, and had what appeared to be Rosa's dark hair and James's gray eyes, and he was the most astonishing thing either of them had ever seen. "What do you want to call him?" Rosa asked, when they had been left alone in the quiet and the baby was in her arms, looking at the world with the focused disapproval of the newly born. James looked at the boy, his boy. The word settled in him like something coming home and was quiet for a moment. "Eli," he said, "for your father, if that is what you want." Rosa looked at him, this man who had come to her gate with nothing and was now her husband and the father of her child, and felt something so full it pressed against her ribs. "And Daniel for his middle name," she said, "if that is what you want." He looked at her and his face was completely open, completely his, no shutters, no sealed windows, just James Trask looking at his wife and his son in the autumn light of a Kansas morning, and he said, "Yes. That is exactly what I want." Eli Daniel Trask came home to the ranch on a bright October afternoon, and everything that lived there arranged itself around him. The land, the horses, the cattle in the south pasture, the cottonwoods along the creek in their full autumn gold, the ranch house that had been Eli Lawson's work and was now the Trask family's life, and the people in it who had all come to their places by different roads and had arrived together at exactly the right one. Red the bull, surveying the yard from his pasture gate with his characteristic territorial air, appeared entirely unmoved by the new arrival, which Pete took as a personal affront on the baby's behalf. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was the kind of Kansas winter that could have been brutal but was instead, for the people inside it, simply winter, a thing with its own beauty, its own discipline, its own pleasures. Eli was a baby of strong opinions and excellent lungs, and the bunkhouse was close enough to the main house that Pete later claimed he could time the night feedings by the carrying distance of the crying. James was a father with the attentiveness of a man who understood deeply what it meant to be entrusted with a small person's entire existence. He held his son with a care that Rosa recognized from the first time she had seen him in the barn with a newborn calf. That same careful, aware tenderness, the recognition of something fragile and alive in his hands. But there was none of the distance in it this time, none of the protective removal. He held his son and knew what he was holding, and his face showed every bit of it. Rosa watched this as she had watched everything about James from the beginning, with the clear attention of a woman who knew how to see what was real. She saw him talking to the baby in the particular low voice he used, and thought of the calving barn and the heifer and that strange, resonant evening when she had understood that something was returning to this man, some capacity for tenderness that grief had closed away, and that could not, it turned out, be closed away forever. He had not held a living thing gently in over a decade before she handed him that newborn calf, and she had watched something return in him. She had watched it and known what it was and been careful with it, and here, a year and a half later, was what it had returned to. A son, a home, a life he had stopped believing he was allowed to want. She thought about this in the long winter evenings when the fire was low and the baby was asleep and James was reading, his arm around her on the settee, the wind moving around the house with its cold commentary. She thought about how close it had all come to not happening, how many forks there had been in the road of it, how many moments where he might have pulled back and she might have let him, and how fortunate she was, how fortunate they both were, that neither of them had. She did not articulate most of this to him, because it was the kind of thing that did not require articulation, that lived in the fabric of ordinary days, in the coffee drunk together at the kitchen table, and the fence mended in easy parallel, and the way he always knew when something was bothering her before she had fully acknowledged it herself. But one evening she said, "Do you think about what you would have done if the roan hadn't stopped at my gate?" James lowered his book and considered it with genuine seriousness. "No," he said finally, "I can't imagine it clearly enough to think about it." Which I suppose means I can't imagine what I would have done, because I cannot imagine being anywhere else now. "That is," Rosa said, "a very good answer. I had a good teacher," he said, and he said it lightly but meant it fully. The following spring, the spring of 1884, brought the return of warmth and work in calving, and also a letter from Pete Aldridge's family in Missouri that requested Pete's return to help with a family difficulty of some seriousness. Pete came to tell them himself, and Rosa saw in his face the conflict of a young man being pulled in two directions, and she told him that his place on the ranch was his as long as he wanted it, and that they would manage without him until he chose to come back, and she meant every word. He left on a Tuesday morning in early April, and the goodbyes had the earnest unself-consciousness of people who had worked and eaten and laughed together for 2 years. James shook Pete's hand and said, "You're a good hand, Pete, whatever you go on to do," and Pete looked at him with the expression of a young man who has just been told the thing he most needed to hear. Danny Holt and Clarence Webb kept the ranch running ably, and by June, they had taken on a new hand named Thomas Bird, a younger man with quick hands and good instincts who had grown up on a ranch in the Indian Territory. Thomas spoke carefully about his family, who were Creek, and navigated the world with the particular watchfulness of a man who knew how many places in Kansas in 1884 would make that a problem. James made no issue of it. Rosa made no issue of it. Clarence and Danny followed their lead, and Thomas Bird settled into the rhythm of the ranch with gratitude and competence in equal measure. Rosa thought about the way the frontier worked, how the land itself was indifferent to a man's origins, how it asked only what you put into it, and how the human beings on it were so much slower than the land to understand this. She thought about this, and about the way her father had conducted himself, which had always been with the basic respect of one working person for another, and she tried to conduct herself the same way. Eli Daniel Trask grew through his first year with the vigorous determination of a child who had received, from both parents, a profound belief in forward motion. He was walking at 11 months, poorly but emphatically. He had James's directness and Rosa's stubbornness, which was observed and commented upon by Hector Reyes with great amusement when the family came to Sunday dinner in the summer. Hector and Maria had become, in the course of the 2 preceding years, something very like family. Their daughter Elena, who was now 18 and had come into her own competence and opinions, was a frequent visitor at the ranch, and had formed a particular attachment to baby Eli that he seemed to reciprocate, possibly because she was the only one who could reliably make him laugh by the time he was 6 months old. The Reyes family and the Trask family settled into the close neighborly friendship of people who have chosen to rely on each other, which in the context of the Kansas frontier in the 1880s was not a small thing. The land was changing. The railroad had brought commerce but also competition. The big cattle operations were remaking the economics of the range. The wild first decades of the frontier were giving way to something more structured, and in some ways more demanding. Small operations like the Trask Ranch survived by being excellent at what they did and by having people they could depend on. They were excellent. They had people. They endured. In the autumn of 1884, when the trees along Caldwell Creek had turned, and the cattle were fat from summer grass, and Eli was pulling himself along furniture and looking at the world with his father's gray-eyed assessment, Rosa sat on the porch one evening and watched James come across the yard from the barn. He moved with the unhurried ease of a man at home in his body and his life, his jacket open despite the cool air, his hat tilted back, something in his posture that was the opposite of the closed and road-worn figure she had watched from this same porch 2.5 years ago. He came up the steps and sat beside her, and she leaned into his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they looked at the sky together, the long Kansas evening coming on with its usual theatrical beauty. "I was thinking," she said. "About what?" "About the day you rode up to the gate," she said. "The first day." He was quiet for a moment. "I thought about riding past," he said. "I want you to know that I almost did." "What stopped you?" "I don't entirely know," he said. "I remember thinking that the sign was well kept, that someone cared about this place, and I thought just a bed and work for a season, just a rest." He paused. "I had no idea." Rosa turned her face up to look at him, and he was looking down at her, and his expression was the full and open thing she loved, the thing that had taken months to become available and was now simply his face, James Trask's face, her husband's face, the face that belonged to this life. "I am glad you stopped," she said. "I am glad you opened the gate," he said. Eli's voice reached them from inside the house, where Danny Holt was conducting babysitting duties with more enthusiasm than expertise, and they both laughed, and James stood and held out his hand to her, and she took it, and they went inside together into the lamplight and the noise and the life they had built. The winter that followed was full, not in the sense of being crowded or burdened, but full in the way a good life was full, with the small and the large present in roughly equal measure. Eli grew toward speaking with the same purposeful progress he had brought to walking, his first words landing in the kitchen and the barn with the weight of considerable event. His first clear word, to the significant satisfaction of everyone present, was "horse," which was followed within a week by "pa," which reduced James Trask to a stillness so complete that Rosa reached over and squeezed his hand and said nothing, because nothing was required. James read to Eli in the evenings from whatever was available, which started with the few children's books Rosa had acquired from the general store in Caldwell, and eventually included anything at hand, because James had discovered that Eli did not care about content so much as voice. He would listen to a history of the Comanche Nation with the same focused attention as a story about animals, as long as his father was the one speaking. Rosa would come to the doorway of the bedroom and stand watching them, this large quiet man and this small purposeful child, the lamplight warm on both of them, and feel a happiness that was not complicated by anything. She was pregnant again by February of 1885, and she told James over breakfast with the same directness as the first time, and his response this time was immediate and unambiguous. He stood up and came around the table and gathered her up from her chair, and she laughed into his shoulder at the enthusiasm of it. "Better," she said. "Much better than all right." "I was overwhelmed the first time," he said with dignity. "You were," she agreed. The second pregnancy was easier in some ways and harder in others, which was simply the nature of things, and Rosa ran the ranch through it with her usual competence, and the assistance of a husband and a crew who had all developed strong opinions about what she should and should not lift. She found the collective concern touching and occasionally maddening and said so. Hector Reyes brought Maria over every week through the spring and summer, which Rosa appreciated practically, and Maria conducted as though it were a series of social occasions, which Rosa also appreciated in the more complex way that good friendship was sometimes appreciated, for its refusal to let hard things be only hard. Their daughter was born in August of 1885, on a morning when the ranch smelled of summer, and the cottonwoods were fully green, and the world was maximally alive. She arrived with the same emphatic announcement as her brother, and she had Rosa's dark eyes, and as became apparent over the following weeks James's capacity for direct and penetrating assessment, which she deployed from her cradle with impressive effectiveness. Her name was Clara Ellen Trask. Ellen for James's wife, because Rosa had suggested it first, with a directness and love that had made James go very still in the way she understood now, the way that meant something had landed in him with full weight. "You don't have to," he said. "I want to," she said. "She was part of you and you are part of us. Let her be remembered here. Let Clara carry something of her forward." He had held Clara Ellen for a long time that afternoon, in the bedroom with the August light coming in, and Rosa had watched his face move through everything it moved through, the grief and the joy, the past and the present, all of it present simultaneously, all of it belonging to the same life, and she had felt, watching him, that she was seeing the full measure of who he was, all of it, the weight and the beauty of it together. This was the man she loved. This whole complicated real man, all his history and all his presence, the decade of loneliness and the careful unfurling and the laughter and the steadiness and the way he said her name, and the way he held a living thing gently. By the autumn of 1885, the Trask Ranch was a different place than the Lawson spread that James had ridden up to in the spring of 1882, not because the land was different, but because the life on it was fuller. 2 children, a strong crew, the friendship of good neighbors, a house that was genuinely and daily inhabited by people who wanted to be there. Rosa's father's legacy had not been erased, it had been built upon, which was better. Pete Aldrich came back, as Rosa had said he could in September of that year, his family situation resolved, himself a year older and a year more settled in who he was. He came through the gate the same way James had come through it 3.5 years before, dusty from the road, hat pulled low, and Rosa met him at the fence and opened the gate and said, "Your bunk is still your bunk," and he smiled the big uncomplicated smile of a young man coming home. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. "Rosa," she said. She always corrected him on that. He always forgot. James shook his hand in the yard with genuine warmth, and Eli, who was nearly 2 years old and had no particular reason to understand who Pete was but excellent instincts about people who were happy to see him, went up Pete immediately and held up his arms with commanding expectation. Pete picked him up with the confidence of a man who had been partially raised by proximity to this child's development and looked at Rosa. "He's bigger." "They do that," Rosa said. That winter, with the ranch full of the particular noise of children and the particular quiet of 2 people who had chosen well, James found the crate of books he had ordered from a catalog in Wichita, which arrived in November on the stage. He had not mentioned it to Rosa, and when the crate was opened in the parlor and she saw the titles histories, 2 volumes of philosophy, a natural history of the American West, and 3 that were simply stories, novels, she looked at him and then at the books and then at him again. "When did you order these?" "July." You've been waiting 4 months for books. I had other things to do while I waited." She picked up the natural history and looked at it with the pleasure of a person who reads. "We are going to need a larger bookshelf." "I know," he said. "I'm going to build one." She looked up at him, this man in the lamplight of her parlor, her children's father, her partner, her husband, the man who had come to her gate with nothing and had given her everything, and she loved him with a completeness that asked for nothing because it already had what it needed. "Of course you are," she said. He built the bookshelf in February. In the workshop he had added to the back of the barn in the previous year, and it was a good one, solid and square, with room for twice what they currently had and space for more. He put it against the parlor wall where the smaller one had been, and transferred the books carefully, and Rosa came in and rearranged them in a different order than he had used, and he watched her do this with the expression of a man who does not agree but has made peace with not every decision being his. "They make more sense this way," she said. "They really don't," he said. "History, then natural history, then stories," she said firmly. "It's logical. I organize them by author's name. That's how libraries organize them. This is a home." He looked at her for a moment and then smiled. "All right," he said, "your way. I knew you'd see reason." "I always see reason," he said. "I just sometimes disagree with your definition of it." She laughed, and he stepped behind her and put his arms around her from behind, his chin at the level of her hair, and they looked at the full bookshelf together in the February afternoon light. "James," she said, "are you happy?" He was quiet for a moment, and she felt him considering it with his characteristic seriousness, giving the question the weight it deserved. "Yes," he said, firmly and without qualification. "I am." She put her hands over his where they clasped at her waist. "Good," she said. "So am I outside." The Kansas winter was going through its last cold ceremony before spring returned. The land lay under its thin February snow, patient as it always was, holding the grass and the seeds and all the waiting green of what was coming. The cattle in the south pasture moved in their slow winter way, and Red, 4 years old now, and the most impressive animal on the ranch by any measure, solid and red and impervious, stood at the corner of his pasture with the commanding air of a creature that knew its own value. Eli was inside the house with Clara, the former attempting to teach the latter a game that primarily seemed to involve knocking things over, and the sound of it came through the parlor wall with the particular music of children being children, alive and loud, and entirely themselves. James Trask stood in the parlor of the ranch house that was his home, his arms around his wife, looking at a bookshelf full of books, and thought about the road from the south and the gate with the sign and the woman who had opened it, and the calf in the straw and what had moved in him in that moment, something returning from wherever he had locked it away, some capacity for being present in the world, for holding things gently, for allowing what was alive to be alive in his hands. He thought about all the years between then and now, the road years, the Texas years, the long season of protecting himself from exactly this, from warmth, from attachment, from the terror and the beauty of loving something that could be lost. He thought about standing in the Kansas rain in June and seeing Rosa Lawson laugh, and about the fence line in the August sunset, and about holding his son for the first time with his wife watching from the bed, and about Clara's dark eyes assessing him from her cradle with an intelligence he recognized as Rosa's and felt proud of in a way that was not entirely rational. He thought about how a life could fold and unfold, how a person could close down to a single necessary point and still, if the right gate opened at the right moment, expand again into something larger than they had been even before the closing. Rosa turned in his arms and looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and there was nothing between them that needed saying and everything between them that was already said in the way of a marriage that had become fully itself, not an arrangement, not a compromise, but a genuine meeting of two people who had come to each other honestly and chosen each other with their eyes open. "The children need supper," she said. "They do," he agreed. "And you need to stop that nonsense about alphabetical order. Author's last name is not nonsense, it's a system. My system is better. We will agree to disagree. We will do no such thing. My house, my order. Our house, he said. Our order. She looked at him, and her expression shifted into the one that was only his to see, the one that was past all the practicality and the directness and the capable rancher that the world saw, the one that was just Rosa, just hers. Our house, she agreed, our order. They went together into the kitchen, where the children were making noise and the fire was going, and the winter light was coming through the window at its low February angle, golden and slanted across the floor. And the Trask ranch went on around them in all its ordinary and extraordinary life, everything it had been and everything it would become, grounded in the land that Rosa's father had worked, and the life they had built on it together, all of it solid and real and theirs. Spring would come again, as it always did. The grass would green and the cattle would calve and the cottonwoods along the creek would leaf out in their brilliant early-season lime, and the road from the south would receive its travelers as it always had, some passing, some stopping, the gate standing ready. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything.